My name is Adam Makos, and I will be the Master of Ceremonies today to tell you a little bit about this special man, this special tank crew. And first, I owe Mr. Clarence Smoyer a bit of an apology. Clarence, we tricked you. We told you we were going to the Pentagon today for a book signing, and that is not the case. You're going to be getting the Bronze Star that you earned in World War II, and so is the rest of your tank crew. With a combined With 5 Bronze Stars, you will be possibly our most decorated tank crew of World War II. Your Senator, Senator Pat Toomey, is here with us today. Brigadier General John Howerton is here from the White House. Your war buddies are here. They're seated at your side. There's Joe Caserta, who served in the tank behind you, battling its way through Cologne. Buck Marsh is there, one of the young armored infantrymen who used to ride your tank into battle. The families of your crewmates are here too. They've come from across the country to be with you. Friends and supporters from far and near. And Clarence, if you saw those gentlemen in the tank uniforms today, well, there's an old friend who's here to see you. It's parked back there on the other side of the mall, but a World War II Sherman tank has come to reunite you with your old friend. Frank Buck from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, has brought this tank from his collection. His son Adam drove it, and it's bivouacked back there, and it's painted like your old tank, Eagle. We've been working for a month now with the National Park Service, with Captain Fenley of the Park Police, to bring in this tank. We owe a lot of thanks to Mr. Fred Smith, the CEO of FedEx. When we needed a venue, he said, "I've got one for you, the World War II Memorial." And our friend Holly Rotundi, who runs the Friends of the World War II Memorial, made all this possible for us. It's been an amazing process, but the most amazing part is that for a month, everyone has kept the secret that you are today getting the Bronze Star. My name is Adam Makos, as I mentioned, and the best years of my life have been spent working with Mr. Smoyer to write the book Spearhead, the story of an American tank crew. But it's more than just his story. It's a story of these faces you see over here. Names like DeRiggi, Davis, Early, McVeigh, and of course Smoyer. My friend Major Pete Seminoff led me to Smoyer's door many years ago. He told me that there was a World War II hero living in obscurity. His neighbors didn't know what he did in the war. His daughter Cindy will confirm his own family had seldom heard what he did in the war. And as I began to interview him, I learned that he actually destroyed 5 German tanks in combat. And it struck me, how could such a gentle man, a gentle giant, a teddy bear, you might say, of a World War II veteran, how could he be such a lethal tank gunner? Did he just want to kill the most Germans? And as I got to know Clarence, I came to realize Clarence saw the men inside of his tank as his family. He said, we were a family locked in a sardine can. And he was a great gunner. He was a crack shot because he cared about the men inside his tank. Because he knew if he missed, his family might pay the price. He was a great gunner because he wanted to bring his friends home. And used to tell himself, don't miss, don't miss, don't miss. That was 6 years ago we began working on this book, and now Clarence has become somewhat of a celebrity. Kids from around the country send him drawings of tanks. Kids build model tanks in their shop class and send them to him as gifts. Neighbors bring him fudge. He gets out of parking tickets in his own neighborhood. And his favorite part of going to any book signing is that he gets smothered in kisses from the women. And I promise you, I have seen his face covered in lipstick. It happens. But the best part of Clarence Smoyer is he doesn't let it go to his head. I'm just the same old guy, he says. So today, the Bronze Star will be awarded to him and his crew. But why? What's the action for? What's so special that we would go back almost 75 years to celebrate some men from a bygone era? The day was March 6, 1945, the Battle for Cologne. It was Germany's fortress city. We had to capture it, the 3rd largest city. The battle was about over. It was the last hour, and 2 Sherman tanks were making their way toward Cologne's cathedral. Once they took the cathedral, the battle would be won. Victory was in sight, and in one of those tanks was a man, Lieutenant Karl Kellner. Kellner had a fiancée, Cecilia, back home. He had been a grocery store clerk before the war. He had just earned a battlefield commission. He wore the Silver Star himself. And as he approached the cathedral in his Sherman tank, 2 shots rang out, one and then a second. Kellner's tank began steaming. The crew began coming out, and Kellner rolled over the turret, missing his right leg. It had been torn off at the knee. He was bleeding. His gunner came out and dove over the side of the tank, head first, 9 feet to the ground. 3 of the men would never leave that tank. They died inside. And Kellner was carried to a shell hole, where Andy Rooney, the journalist of future acclaim, was there to help him and to try to tie the tourniquet around his leg. And they watched as Karl Kellner bled to death before their eyes in the last hour of the battle for Cologne. The call for help went out. There was a German Panther tank that pulled up from an ambush position and parked in front of the cathedral. It was daring anyone else to come forward. Now, the commanders in the area looked at their available forces. They said, well, we can't send the Shermans up the street anymore, so we're going to send the light tank. We're going to send the Stuarts, and we're going to send some infantrymen on foot. We're going to send Mr. Buck Marsh and his infantry squad. We're going to give them a bazooka, and we're going to send them up against the pride of the Wehrmacht, the Panther tank. It was a suicide mission. That tank crew had come out to stay and to fight to the last round. Its commander would later say he was proud he never had to tell his men to fight to the last shell. In other words, they had a fanatical devotion to duty. Now, 1 street over, the Pershing tank with a crew of Eagle 7 was parked. They were idling there, having led the charge through the city, having fought street by street. And they heard of their fellow Americans going forward to deal with this Panther tank. And they looked at each other and they said, that should be us. They made a plan. They volunteered. Clarence used to always say, we had the biggest gun, we belong out in front. It was true, they had an experimental tank, a 90-millimeter gun, one of 20 Pershings in the European theater. And he felt that came with a responsibility. That responsibility was to go forward, to go first, and to take the risk. Now, a daring Army cameraman named Jim Bates decided he was going to practice some extreme journalism long before it was popular. And Bates went ahead to where this Panther tank was, and he climbed into the window of a building, and he set up his camera. He was going to capture a gunfight in the streets, a Pershing versus a Panther. And he positioned himself, set up the camera, and suddenly the Panther's gun turned toward him. He thought it might have seen him. It was facing the street, the intersection below him. It was ready for what would ever come up that street. What was coming up that street was Clarence's Pershing tank. Buck Marsh heard it. He heard the rumble through the streets. Bates heard it. Joe Caserta watched the tank go forward. Some people thought they were watching an American tank crew drive to their deaths. But inside that tank, they had a plan. William McVeigh held a steady throttle. Bob Early, in the commander's position, was talking on the microphone, urging them forward. Clarence Smoyer had pre-positioned the gun to the right and lowered it to where he thought that Panther tank would be when they turned the corner. And when they breached the intersection, Homer Davis saw it first. He let out a cry. They were muzzle to muzzle with this German tank, separated by 70 yards. And when Clarence looked through his gun sight, he was looking down the barrel of that German tank. McVeigh slammed the steering brakes back, bringing the tank to a halt. And Clarence knew milliseconds would determine his crew's life or death. So he fired once, anywhere he could, to disrupt the German tank. He hit it in the engine bay. He called for another shell, and John DeRiggi, his loader, slammed the shell into the breech. Clarence then pumped another shell into the Panther tank, and then another. Why 3 shots? Well, his experience as a gunner had taught him that any German crewman, in a last dying gasp, could reach to the trigger of that Panther tank, pull the trigger, and it would wipe his crew from the face of the earth. So he decided to hit that tank until it burned. And he did. 3 shells and the tank went up in flames. The camera captured it all. Clarence's tank backing up, kicking out the smoking shells. And then cameraman Jim Bates came down, and he rapped on the turret, and he said, "I got it. I got it all." He asked the crew to come out. He needed one more shot. He needed those faces. Those are the faces that had just stared death in the eyes not more than 5 minutes before. He captured that shot. The newsreel went around the world. And on the home front, Clarence's family watched him on the big screen. They saw him come up. They saw that he forgot to wear his helmet. He often got in trouble for that. And best of all, they knew that their son was still alive. Now, Clarence was supposed to get the Bronze Star for that action. It was heroic. It was caught on film. His comrades were calling him the hero of Cologne. Joe Caserta saw it. Buck Marsh saw it. It was indisputable. And then Clarence went for a walk. 2 days later, he was strolling through the ruins of Cologne, and he encountered some German kids. Now, there was a rule: no fraternizing with the enemy. Not men, not women, not children. No talking to them. They are universally evil. But these kids started pulling on Clarence's jacket and begging for something. They wanted bubble gum. They assumed every American GI carried it. And Clarence started searching his pockets for a stick of gum. Couldn't find one, so he began shooing the kids out of the street, and that's when the MPs turned the corner in a Jeep. They caught him. They cited him, took his name, rank, and serial number, and that information made its way to his captain, and Clarence's Bronze Star went up in smoke that day in March 1945. When he first told me that, I couldn't believe it. You lost the Bronze Star over a stick of gum. Clarence shrugged it off, but I could tell this actually hurt him. It carried great injury to him. It all made sense when he told me about Paul Faircloth. Paul was his first commander in a Sherman tank, and he watched Paul during a mortar bombardment. Some GIs had been wounded. They were screaming. And Paul came out of that turret, and he left his Tommy gun in the turret, and he said, "You're in charge of the tank. I've got to help those guys. Someone has to help those guys." And Clarence watched as Paul ran through the mortar fire, through the smoke, until a mortar shell landed at his feet and threw him up against a bank. Paul landed upside down. His leg was cut off. And Clarence watched as his commander bled to death there at Mons, Belgium, in September 1944. Paul gave his life for his country. And what did he receive as a reward? He was recognized with a Bronze Star, with a V for valor. So suddenly it all made sense. Clarence sees that medal, and he sees the guys who came before. He sees all the men who wore it, and it means something special to him. So how do we go back 74 years and make this right? Well, for me, it began when I was pouring through 1,000 pages of documents, and one line stood out to me out of 1,000. I've got it right here. And that line was, it's an official Army order. Early Robert M., Staff Sergeant, is awarded the Bronze Star for heroic achievement in action against the enemy, 6th of March, 1945. When I saw that, I said, wait a second, 6th of March, that's the Panther. He got the Bronze Star for destroying the Panther. And I asked Clarence, did Bob Early ever tell you this? You shared a turret with him. You were on the right side. He was on the left. Did he ever tell you when you lived together in that tank? And he didn't. See, Early kept it quiet because he might have been ashamed. He might have wanted to cushion the blow of Clarence losing that medal. He never told his own friend that he received the Bronze Star. Then I found another document. It said that daring cameraman Jim Bates, he got the Bronze Star. So he got the award for filming the Panther. But what about the man who pulled the trigger? That set forward the process that began today. We got the form from the Army. How do you submit for the Bronze Star? We got the witnesses, Joe Caserta, Buck Marsh, Harley Swenson out in Minnesota, one of the light tank commanders who had to risk his life that day. They filled out their statements, and we brought it to Senator Toomey, whose name and reputation carries great weight. And he agreed to sponsor this award, to bring it to the Army with his endorsement. Well, the Army took the award and began processing it. That was 2 years ago. Clarence got his spot in a long line of applications. There were a lot of young men being considered for the Bronze Star from the new wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was a long waiting list. And we began to get worried. This summer, Clarence turned 96 in June. He said, this has to happen soon or later. And my friend Ken Wong, who is a civilian assistant to the Secretary of the Army, he's here today somewhere. He's right there. Ken told me, he said, I'm hosting somebody really cool. He said, the Sergeant Major of the Army, Dan Daly, is going to be coming to Philadelphia with me, and we're going to be hosting a town hall. Sergeant Major of the Army Daly was the equivalent of a general, the highest ranking enlisted man. And he said, maybe he can help. Well, we brought Clarence's plight to Daly. And Daly said, let me see what I can do. Let's see if we can put some heat on this. A couple weeks later, we got a call from the Army. Now, they needed something. They said, we need to ask you something. Can you find the serial numbers and the hometowns and the ranks and all the details on the rest of Clarence's crew? Davis, DeRiggi, McVeigh. The Army is about teamwork. And this crew spoke to them. It spoke to that value. They won the Panther duel as a team. The loader loaded. The driver drove. The bow gunner sounded the alarm. And yes, the gunner pulled the trigger. The Army was talking about 4 Bronze Stars. And one day the email came. It said, board ruled in majority. So I wrote back naturally, what does that mean? He said, they're all getting the Bronze Star. So well done to the Army for going above and beyond to recognize the teamwork of this crew. When and where would they get the Bronze Star? I asked. It's a prerogative of the family, he said. The veteran and the family decide. So I went to Cindy, Clarence's daughter, with an idea. Why don't we bring all the families together? Why don't we bring Clarence and the crew member, the descendants of his crew, to get their Bronze Stars in one place together? And Senator Toomey's office agreed, and they supported it. They said, let's recognize the teamwork of Eagle 7 at the World War II Memorial, and let's not tell Clarence about it. So the McVeigh family came here from Kentucky, the Davis family from Michigan, and the DeRiggis from Levittown, and here we are. You're about to soon see them become one of the most decorated tank crews in history.